And I'd love for this to be more of a back and forth. You know, I'm glad that these sessions are open to the public, but I wish I could actually be with you in person, but maybe next year. And you know, there's a fair bit of relevance for this topic, particularly in terms of ventilation, given COVID and the reasons that we're doing this virtually right now. Also, if something does, you know, go completely off the rails, technology-wise, I suddenly get muted or you can't see my screen, please feel free to share that, because if you're having that issue, others probably are too. But like I said, probably won't look at the chat box until the very end. And there will be a survey at the end, which helps us and helps Idaho Power know how we're doing. So without further ado, let's launch into high performance classrooms. For those that aren't aware of the University of Idaho Integrated Design Lab, or a branch of the Art and Architecture Department, there's about 7 of us. We're a mix of kind of faculty, staff, and graduate students, blend of architecture and engineering. We do research and design for high-performing buildings that are doing well at their jobs of housing occupants comfortably, while using very little energy to do so. And so this topic is really focused on both of those, high-performance classrooms and making sure that they are energy efficient. We also have our technical design assistance program. You can look online, you can fill out a survey, and this is a really great Idaho Power sponsored program. You know, they're also sponsoring this whole talk as well. But if you are working on a school or another commercial project and you or your firm doesn't have necessarily the expertise, or you want to learn more about a particular technology, look online and see if this is a program that could help you. We do kind of phase 1 and phase 2 are pretty much 100% covered by Idaho Power. The project has to be approved, but we'll take any phone call, pretty much anybody walking in the door, well, virtually these days. And we can help on like basic simulations, or do kind of design reviews and recommendations for energy efficiency. Or if you've got a really big project and you want us to help, you know, do, you know, full on from the design charrette process all the way through, you know, design review and submitting documents, we can help push that project further in terms of, you know, coordinating its energy efficiency. And there is a slight cost share at the phase 3 level, but that can often be, you know, well worth it for the owners in terms of long-term energy savings. So we love to help on these projects. Thanks to Idaho Power for having this program. And if you have more questions, feel free to follow up with me afterwards, or look on our website at idlboise.com. We also have a separate lecture program focused specifically on building simulation. That's kind of my background and specialty. I'm really excited for a couple weeks from now. We've got Tim Johnson at Cushing-Terrell. He's going to be talking on performance modeling for standards and code compliance. Very, very relevant for you know, anybody that's doing a lot of energy modeling in the Valley and elsewhere. So please feel free to join us virtually. We also give away prizes. Thanks to Idaho Power for sponsoring that. So another program that we have here, Idaho Power has provided us with over 900 different tools, I believe, everything from thermal cameras to data loggers and light meters. So you can really see, you know, how is your building performing? Maybe you've done a lot of operational changes because of COVID, and you want to see, you know, whether you're getting adequate pressure or flow through your building. You want to measure the amount of outdoor air. How's your CO2 levels? You know, look for thermal leakage around your envelope. We've got the tools for that. Look at our website. You can fill out a request form. Maybe you just have a problem, but you don't know the tool for the problem. We can help with that. We can do kind of no contact pick up and drop off of those tools, which is great. So it's safe during COVID, and we're up and running with this program. Last but not least, there is the Commercial and Industrial Energy Efficiency Program from Idaho Power. Visit their website listed here if you have a new construction project or a retrofit or something custom that is really kind of pushing the envelope in terms of energy efficiency, and you think there might be some incentives to do that. All right, so let's move into high performance classrooms. My main goal for the next 40 minutes or so is to try and really put metrics to good classroom. So we want, I would assume, our kids to be in good learning environments. But what does that actually mean? How do we quantify that? How do we measure that? I think there's 4 key indicators for classroom performance. One is temperature. The next is air quality. We're really focused on that right now in terms of health. Third is light. And last but not least is noise transmission within the room itself. So that's kind of the structure for today. And then I want to end a little bit on funding mechanisms for those. But if we look at those, 4 key indicators of temperature, lighting, ventilation, noise, they overlap pretty evenly with energy use in terms of schools. The majority of energy use in schools goes towards HVAC, heating, ventilating, and cooling, along with a fairly significant portion for lighting. So by making classrooms that are good, we can also make them efficient, and they don't have to be in competition with each other, although they can be. So looking at criteria number 1, temperature. I'm coming from an engineering background, HVAC's my specialty. I'll try not to talk ad nauseum about this, but I believe it's very, very important and often overlooked within classrooms. Thermal discomfort can really affect not only mood, but also student performance. So there is a German magazine called Plus One. It's their European equivalent to our journal Nature. So it's the big one. And a big study came out in I think it was 2019, on how students performed at the same math test given different temperatures within that classroom. And what they found was that by raising the temperature by 2 degrees, you could actually affect math scores by 2%. So that's showing a one-to-one, correlation, causation actually, of comfort and thermal conditions affecting student performance. I think we know this intuitively. If we're shivering, we're not going to be paying attention as well. If we're sweating, we're going to be falling asleep. But like I said, there are a number of studies out there that actually have the data to back this up. So maybe you're an architect, maybe you're an engineer, and you're designing these classrooms, or you're responding to a bid from a particular district. You may know this intuitively, but I hope this presentation can actually give you some references to bring to the table to really argue for better HVAC equipment, increased zoning, increased temperature control within the classroom, because it really does affect student performance. And that's what we want our buildings to be, is good performing. The other thing is that it's our thermal comfort sensation. If you've listened to me talk about radiation before, you know that the surrounding surface temperatures actually have even more of an impact on our sensation of comfort than the air temperature. And so if you're in a classroom, maybe it's an older school in a rural environment, and it still has single pane windows, if it's 0 degrees outside, the interior surface temperature of that window is 15 degrees. Whereas the thermostat might be on the other side of this classroom, and it's reading 70 degrees. So air temperature might look okay, but what's actually going to be happening within the classroom is you're going to feel a draft down here. You're going to get these convection cells as that air sticks to that cold surface and then falls down on these students. They're also going to be feeling the radiant exchange, kind of losing heat to that cold surface. So this makes an unequitable learning environment. The students at the perimeter here are actually at a disadvantage to the students that are closer to the interior. If we look at a double pane window, more code standard, uh, that surface temperature when it's 0 degrees outside is still down at 45 degrees. So that's a 25-degree temperature difference with the air. So you're still going to get some convection cells in here and still get a sensation of a draft, even if that envelope is pretty tightly sealed. So, it's less dramatic than a single pane window, but still really affecting those students. By the time you look at a triple pane window, something that might come across in like a passive standard, the interior surface temperature of that window is much more closely aligned to the actual indoor air temperature, meaning that the radiant exchange within this place is more even, and it's a much more equitable learning environment. So if your son or daughter is assigned a seat next to the window, they're no longer at a disadvantage during those cold winter days. So just something to keep in mind. I really try and bring this down from just sensations to actual quantities. So how do we quantify thermal comfort? ASHRAE standard 55 has that predicted mean vote. So you want to be in the Goldilocks range at 0. If you're in the negative range between -0.5 and -3, that's cold. And if you're in the positive range above 0.5 and up to 3, that means you're too hot. And that has a direct correlation with the percentage of population that's dissatisfied. So if you get to a PPD of 1, or a PMV of 1 rather, that corresponds to 25% of the students or the occupants in that space being uncomfortable, which is going to affect their learning and their performance. We were fortunate enough through Idaho Power to do a survey of a few different high school classrooms within the valley. So instead of looking at just thermostat readings, we looked at air temperature, relative humidity, air velocity within the room, and surface temperatures to really kind of quantify holistically how are these spaces doing. And what we found is that on average, they were far too cold. When we entered in kind of the student activity, their clothing levels, and took all of these factors into account, we were far below that predicted mean vote of -1. So, if a third to a half of these students are predicted to be, chilly within this environment, which means their blood circulation is going to change. They're going to have less dexterity in their fingers, maybe a little bit slower at writing. All of these things matter. And you might say, well, they should just put on more sweaters. Well, the thing was, we did this during the fall, the early part of the school year, when it was actually warm. And so the air conditioning was actually coming on, and we could see this from our data. The AC units would kick on in this particular classroom and keep it uncomfortably cold, spending extra energy until the end of the school day, at which point it would, rise. So this is looking at 4 different Idaho classrooms. There was one that drifted into the semi-comfortable range. Pretty much all of the rest were down in that cold range, using extra energy to keep the students particularly chilly. So we did offer kind of some alternative cooling set points. The biggest one, I think that should be noted, especially for facility managers or maybe for engineers noting in their designs, is instead of starting off just having a hard start of when your cooling should begin right at occupancy, all of those surfaces are going to be much cooler in the morning before students arrive and start heating up the desks and the walls, and you turn on computers and projectors. All that takes a while to build up, but remember that we're more attuned physically to the surrounding surface temperatures. So you can save on cooling energy, one, by just raising the thermostat set point, but even more significantly by pushing that cooling set point to not happen quite so early in the day, but maybe a little bit later in the afternoon, maybe by period 2 or 3, when those surfaces start warming up. That's when the kids could really appreciate that cooler air. But in the morning, you're just going to be kind of freezing them to their desks, and there's no need for that. All right, so that kind of covers criteria number 1. And criteria number 2, I'll also spend a bit of time on this one, because it's highly relevant, is air quality. And good ventilation, like I said, these has a measurable impact on how well students concentrate, how well they do on tests, how good they are at making decisions, how fast they are at completing assignments, and especially importantly, decreasing absences by removing more germs from the spaces themselves. Right? So there are many more studies than these, but I wanted to highlight some of the ones that have come out in the last 5 to 7 years. I put together this slide in January of 2020, so that's weird. You know, it's very important now that we try and get rid of germs within our spaces. But there's also other factors at play. There's volatile organic compounds from any time a classroom has been repainted or recarpeted. If the school windows are open next to, you know, the pickup line or where the school buses are, you know, that exhaust might drift into the classroom, or you might have your, you know, makeup air handlers too close to where those automobiles are lining up. And if you don't have enough ventilation within the space, even just breathing, kids breathing at a higher rate will raise the carbon dioxide levels. Not that carbon dioxide is going to harm you, but our bodies really respond to that. Yeah, I'll mention that in a minute. But so it used to be ventilation was entirely based on bioeffluence and just smells alone of how bad is somebody's BO. Thankfully, we're a bit beyond that. And we're getting more into quantifying indoor air quality based on carbon dioxide measurement. This study is out of Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory, where they had a group of individuals. Now, I believe these are adults, not children, but I think that the findings should carry over. And what you're looking at on this graph is 3 different concentrations of carbon dioxide within the space, or how well ventilated it is. The black is very high concentrations, 2,500 parts per million of CO2. Blue is kind of the threshold right now that ASHRAE has. If you're above 1,000, you're considered not doing great. If you're below 1,000, you're doing good. Atmospherically in Boise, we're usually around the 450-ish, 480-ish range of parts per million in terms of CO2. So a 600 shows that there's some people breathing in the space, but it's pretty close to outdoor conditions. And in a variety of different activities, the higher the concentration of CO2, the more performance was impacted, particularly in terms of taking initiative, in terms of formulating strategies, or even just basic activities. And it's not because CO2 is poisonous, but it's similar to thermal comfort, how our bodies are wired to respond to the surrounding surface temperatures. Our bodies take signals from the carbon dioxide in the air as whether it's a good place to breathe, and whether you have enough oxygen. So as the CO2 levels rise, the oxygen levels can be just fine. You can have plenty of oxygen, but your body thinks that you're not getting enough, and you're going to start yawning. And your blood circulation is going to change and try and compensate for this. So even if you do have enough oxygen within the space, if you have too many people breathing and you're not, you know, flushing that out with fresh air, it's really going to affect employee performance within your offices, but especially, I think, you know, kids, which have a faster metabolism and a higher, you know, lung to air kind of ratio in terms of exchange. They're more attuned to this. Their bodies are, and so it's pretty important. So when we did our kind of thermal study within classrooms, we also popped in a few carbon dioxide meters to see how they were doing in terms of indoor air quality. And you can see this classroom did all right. We're getting into this yellow range, which is not great. Green is good. Red is making kids pretty sleepy. And you can see, you know, during the day when kids, or during the weekends when kids aren't there, you're doing just fine. But when class is in session, it's definitely spiking and kind of a little bit into this red range above 1,500 parts per million. Not dangerous, but just not great and not ideal for really getting the most concentration and performance from the student in terms of their learning environment. Unfortunately, this was one of the better classrooms that we saw. This was a separate classroom, and our meter cannot go higher than 2,000 parts per million. So we were capping it out pretty much every time class was in session there. And this wasn't just public schools. We did a separate project at a charter school. And once again, we were kind of capping out our meter during the day when these kindergartners were in the classroom. And unfortunately, well, I should say fortunately, within this classroom at this charter school, it was designed to have really good ventilation. Each classroom had its own CO2 monitor that was tied to an outdoor air exchange unit up on the roof. Each one had its own rooftop unit. But the meter within the classroom had been set to not actually kick in until the CO2 concentration peaked at 2,000 parts per million. So it was installed, but not operating. So thankfully, we noticed this, they changed it. But these sensors can be a little bit of a headache for facility managers, for school managers. I had a conversation kind of off the record with another engineer who said, he was trying to put in CO2 monitors at a school in Idaho, and the facility manager said, you can install those. I'm going to take them out because I just don't have the funding. I don't have the time to run around and hit all of those beeping lights because they fail often. They need to be recalibrated every year. And if you have a school building with dozens of classrooms, that is a lot of extra work for a facility manager to do. And there's stretched awfully thin as it is. So that's something to keep in mind. It's just because you have a sensor in there doesn't mean it's necessarily working. And it really comes down to operations and school resources. All right, now this is kind of when ventilation and health start overlapping. I want to spend just a minute on this, but it's very relevant. Boise School District, I think, has put a pause on a lot of their capital projects in terms of new school buildings, and instead they're redirecting their capital resources towards HVAC upgrades and really addressing this. And there's a few different ways to go about it. Thankfully, ASHRAE has come out with a few different guidelines for building operations during COVID-19. They are free resources that are available online. I'll highlight some of the findings, but know that while this is still new, we're watching science happen in real time, we're still doing tests and surveys. We don't have all of the answers, but we have some ideas based on past, SARS research and things like that. I would also highly recommend checking out Kevin Van Den Weimelenberg's talk, which is available on our YouTube site. He's leading an incredible team over at University of Oregon, the Energy Studies and Buildings Laboratory, and they're doing a lot of, literally cutting edge research on COVID and HVAC and how it's being transmitted through buildings. So just Google his name and look at some of his resources as well. Talking today, one of the best ways we can try and remove a virus from a space is to increase the amount of outdoor air that we're bringing in. So that's step number one. And a lot of schools are doing this. But that also means it's going to put a heavy burden on the heating coils, this winter. You can disable demand controlled ventilation. So if you do have those CO2 monitors and they're only kicking in, only bringing in outdoor air when that CO2 level rises enough, you can lock those out. This is recommended by the ASHRAE Foundation for right now to increase that outdoor air. That is going to increase energy usage a little bit. But what we're really trying to do is just flush more fresh air through these spaces while we can. So instead of just relying on CO2 levels, just open up the dampers as much as possible. So, open up that minimum outdoor air that might be at 30% to up to 100%. Bring in 100% outdoor air if possible to limit the amount of recirculation that's happening within your HVAC system, especially if you've got rooftop units or variable air volume systems. Like I said, though, there might be some issues in terms of can you actually handle that load within the building? Typically these units are sized to mix the air and only have a little bit of that super freezing, 20-degree air in the mornings, and then the majority of, say, 70-degree air. Well, that recirculation might carry some germs. We're still figuring that out. CDC has now officially come out and said, yes, COVID is an aerosol. It can be transmitted through, evaporated particles, and it can go through an HVAC system. We don't know if that's primary transmission for, pardon me, it's a little too relevant. We don't know, it's probably not the case that that's the primary mechanism for transmission. It's probably more easily spread through droplets, if you will. But in terms of just trying to be as safe as possible, the more outdoor air you can bring in, the less you're recirculating any spit or aerosols, either of them, the less we recirculate that, the better. If you do recirculate air, then you can increase your filters to MERV 13 or the highest compatible with your filter rack, and really try and seal the edges around that to limit the bypass. Doing so can affect, pressure loss within the system, increase fan energy, and it takes some testing and balancing. And I believe that's something that a lot of the local school districts are doing, but it does come with energy and airflow consequences. So just be mindful of that. And then keep these systems running longer, 24/7. So we're just continually pulling air out of those spaces, not letting germs just kind of settle and build up there overnight. Also consider kind of a portable room air cleaner with a HEPA filter. These can be great. They can also be a little bit noisy, and they do come with, an energy impact. But there has been some data to suggest that HEPA filters can block, COVID particles. You can also consider adding ultraviolet germicidal irradiation, UVGI, into the return duct. So you're basically zapping everything and trying to kill it before it might get recirculated into the classroom. One I didn't mention on here is needlepoint bipolar ionization. Haven't been too many studies on that yet. There's a few that show promise, but we're, like I said, we're still figuring this out in real time. It's going to take a while till we get multiple peer-reviewed studies. There's a couple out there, and it looks promising, and it comes with fairly low energy penalty, but there's more investigation to be done right now. Some people are throwing kind of all of these things at the building. Some are choosing what they can. I don't know that all of these are long-term solutions, but for getting through this particular year, I think it's important. One thing that I do want to mention while I'm just on the topic of ventilation is that if you look kind of back through the second half of these systems, most of them are really focused on those systems that have recirculation, which would be, a VAV, an RTU, even, depending on how it's designed, a heat pump system where you're recirculating a lot of that indoor air. I think this is really a time for us to push towards dedicated outdoor air systems where you're bringing in 100% outdoor air in all the time and you're exhausting, all that internal air. So you've got separate supply and return ducts. This is the standard with VRF or VRV systems. and can be the standard with, 4-pipe fan coils or even, different types of heat pumps. The state of Washington has implemented this and required it for all their educational facilities, I think in their it's either their 2015 or their 2018 energy code. I would love to see Idaho start looking at adopting something like that for classrooms. We're not there yet, but if you're designing right now, I think now would be a good time to really consider some of those options, which might cost a little bit more upfront, but save energy long term and really address some of these recirculation issues. All right, I'm off my soapbox for now. All right, comfort criteria number 3, light. Good daylight really reduces seasonal affective disorder. It's a real thing. If you don't think that it is, just live through another Boise winter with an inversion. 2, you can really, there is good correlation between student test scores and good daylight within the space, as well as increasing math and reading speeds. I don't know how many of you kind of read in dim lights, but I have a bad habit of this. And by the end, I'm kind of squinting, my eyes are tired. My body is spending extra energy to try and process the same information. Same if there's really bad glare on a whiteboard and you're squinting and you're trying to follow along, but all of your energy is not focused on what that person is saying or even has written, but just trying to decipher the words on there. So this comes down to lighting design and making sure that there is like good quality daylight within classrooms. We also know good daylight can have an effect on the indoor biome and the germs that are in there. We know that COVID is not a huge fan of sunlight. And just from a perspective, I mean, if you had a kid that had to go through school from K through 12 in a classroom like the one on the left, or a classroom like the one on the right, I think we all just intuitively know it's much more pleasant to be in a classroom with windows where we get views of nature. But it's more than just putting in windows. So at the top, you can see a classroom, and this is a series of high dynamic range photos that Kevin, when he was at our lab here, really focused on daylight within classrooms. He's got some great research on that. But you can see, once again, like the students that were next to the window early on, that was super cold, versus the students that were at the interior and nice and comfortable. Here we've got another unequitable distribution of light, where the kids at this end of the classroom are getting a different visual experience than the kids sitting over here. And that might be better, it might be worse, but we don't want to handicap certain kids or their learning by making these, highly different visual mediums within the same space. Because if there's glare, our eyes, just like an iPhone camera, are gonna dial down our pupils so that we don't get overwhelmed by that bright light. It's gonna make everything else, including the writing on the whiteboard, look much darker than a student that's over here that might not necessarily have that window in their viewpoint. So we really want kind of evenly distributed light, and diffuse and indirect light. There's much more to be said on that than I'm going to dive into here. Dylan Agnes is on the line, and he's kind of our resident daylighting incentive guy and expert. I'm not, I'm more on the thermal side, but in terms of classrooms, it has a very measurable impact, whether you're adding light shelves here or allowing some of that glare within the space. So please do a little bit of daylighting analysis before you submit your final design review. And just because you have blinds doesn't mean that they're always effective. And it can lead to lights still being on within the room, used unnecessarily, versus having a different temperature, a much nicer true to outdoor spectrum that we have here. All right. Lighting controls. if you went to the trouble, especially in a gym, of adding skylights, which is wonderful, and don't actually specify any of the lighting fixtures to have photocells or to be able to dim when they're unneeded, you're going to be spending a lot of extra money, not only to run the lights, but also to remove all the heat generated by those lights and distribute that air. So make sure that lighting controls are specified within the plans when you are submitting it. All right, last but not least is noise. So our ears kind of develop the ability to pick out individual voices over time. It is not necessarily intuitive. It is a learned response. And so if there is a lot of background noise, I apologize to everyone listening online right now. I am in a room with a whole lot of, well, it's floor vents, but there's a lot of pressure and a lot of airflow coming out of it. And so there's that background hiss. Hopefully the microphone is hiding some of that, but it's certainly slowly giving me tension in my neck, and I feel like I have to speak over that. Kids not only have to deal with, say, background noise from fans, but also, say, hallway interruptions, or if you have open windows or a thin envelope, say single pane windows or leakage within the envelope, thin walls, they are having to spend extra effort, spend extra mental energy to focus in on what that teacher is saying, as opposed to simply listening without all of those other distractions. And because it's a learned response over time, this particularly affects young kids and those who maybe don't have, the 20/20 equivalent of hearing. So this comes down to design. Make sure that the fans within the room, the HVAC distribution, HVAC air distribution within the space is quiet and not at a super high velocity where it's causing a lot of disruption. Make sure that the envelope for students is thick on the building so that you can block some of that exterior noise. While triple pane windows are super expensive, they do affect not only the thermal performance, but also the audio performance within the space and make it a much quieter space to be. Now, one thing I've noticed, and this is just more anecdotal, is the number of people that are now watching Netflix with subtitles. I do that a lot because I'm a nerd and I watch BBC and I can't always understand their accents. But even just like on American shows, because there's like so many other things happening around in the house, I've noticed a lot of people like in their videos and things like that now are watching their full programs, say Office reruns or whatever, with subtitles so that they can actually read the words because they're having trouble picking out the words that are actually coming through from the screen. Maybe we're just all getting worse at this because we have AirPods in our ears all the time and we need really high volumes. Who knows? But you do notice that it can be hard to pick out those voices, even when we want to as adults. And so for kids within a classroom, let's really try and design for classrooms that are quiet, have surfaces that absorb sound, and I think most importantly, don't blast fans and high velocities of air within the space that cause that cognitive disruption from extra noise. So to sum up on kind of the metrics that make an ideal classroom, it's thermally comfortable. According to ASHRAE 55, you're looking at holistic comfort. It's well ventilated. We're not letting those CO2 levels climb too high. It's daylit, so people have views of nature. You've got lighting controls specified within the space, and you're getting indirect light, not direct glare. That's causing kind of a visual impairment from bright splotches within the space. And last but not least, it's a quiet space. All right, so that all sounds great, right? But schools, budgets, tough times for us, especially in Idaho. So Idaho school funding, and I want to wrap this up in the next 10 minutes, but I feel like this is really important. The buildings themselves are tied both to the local property taxes and the state's general fund. We actually don't get a whole lot of federal funding, especially in Boise. It only makes up, I should look at my notes again, but I think about 5% of the funding. The rest really comes from state, local property taxes, and then special levies. So when the school district kind of puts together a plan, they have to, sometimes do a bond when they're doing that RFP for a new building. Whereas operations and maintenance, some of this gets a little bit mixed up, and I'm not a politician. I've tried my best to dive through the district budgets, but it's maybe more for politicians and CPAs than myself. But one thing that's really changed since 2006 is Governor Jim Risch changed some of the property taxes. He lowered some of the property taxes that were going to schools and instead tied some of the school funding to the sales tax, which really varies from year to year. As a result, and this is just maybe not directly from that, but I think it's had a major impact. 92 of our 115 districts within Idaho have had to have supplemental levies for their just operations and maintenance. So that totals $213 million. And a lot of these failed. Nampa's just failed last fall. They're going to try again this year for another 2 years. 14 districts within the state have emergency school levies where they feel like they cannot continue operating unless this passes, and those are at $12 million. The other thing is that, these are tied to taxes, which really lag the rest of the economy, right? Our 2019 tax returns look fine. 2020 tax returns are going to be very different with so many people out of work. But that 2020 tax income isn't actually going to come to the schools until a year from now. So they're going to be facing in the next couple of years some really tough situations. Jim Rice from Caldwell, he's trying to put together a proposal he started a committee at looking at maybe changing some of these fundings, but there's a lot of legislative barriers to raising property taxes, as well as just, personal animus towards that. People already feel like their property taxes are too high, and yet we are growing at such a great rate, and our property taxes can only increase at 3% per year. That's now a mandate. And so a school district in, say, northern Idaho that's not growing all that much might be all right, whereas a school district down in the Ada County area is really struggling to keep up with the amount of growth, while their funding can't increase the same, and therefore they do all these special levies. All that to say, it's not easy to ask people to spend a little bit more on their buildings to improve the situation. But it's still a major part of their budget. And I think there can be an argument made to change the bidding process a little bit so that less is spent on utilities. So right now, the Boise School District budgets $4.8 million for their utility services. That's about $180 per student. If you look at the lifetime, though, of that, $4.8 million, it pales in comparison to initially to like the initial construction cost of a school. But spread out over 50 years, then there starts to be a little bit of parity. So I looked at 3 different schools that were constructed in Ada County in 2016. Their initial construction costs range from $140 to a little over $210 per square foot, whereas their annual maintenance and utility costs were at about $3 per square foot. But if you look at a 50-year building, the lifetime maintenance and utility costs is close to that initial construction cost. And you might say, well, 50 years is way too long for a building. Well, let's look at some elementary schools and high schools within the Treasure Valley. Highlands Elementary is 59 years old. Capitol High, that building's 55 years old. Taft is 109. All of these schools are pushing well beyond that 50-year limit. And so those operation and maintenance costs, if we can reduce them, that's really going to make a really big difference on that long-term budget. So they wouldn't have to do as many special levies, fingers crossed, in the future. So this is coming out of a lobbying group, so take it with a grain of salt. But the Greening America's Schools program found that a 1% building premium led to a return on investment of 20 to 1. The top least fuzzy number, I should say, is a $9 return per square foot in terms of energy implications. So if we kind of go beyond code in terms of, better HVAC systems, better lighting, then there can be that long-term return on investment. They also really found, they pushed this number a lot, the increased earnings over the lifetime of the student that actually goes there in terms of their tax revenue in the future. You can quibble with that number, as well as say, and this is pre-COVID, cold and flu reduction, asthma reduction, teacher retention, but these are real things. And maybe this is skewed too much in terms of, overly optimistic on the benefits, but I think there is a real financial case to be made for spending a little bit more now for better learning outcomes down the road and less energy bills that have to be spent each year. So, fewer special levies, fewer economic hard times in the future. So potential solutions, let's end on a happy note. I think requiring dedicated outdoor air systems, or at least designing them within the space, within classrooms, can be great. Require insulation better than code minimums, or at least design for that. Idaho Power has some great incentives for both of these, and recently provided some great incentive checks down at, I believe it was at Twin Falls Middle School. I don't know, Idaho Power folks might be on the line, so they can correct me. But there's not only just feel good, warm fuzzies about, going a little bit beyond code, but there are real benefits that can be gleaned financially for whatever district is applying for these through some of those incentive programs. So don't ignore those, seek those out. And really set an energy goal for the school. Don't just say the school has to house so many students. Speak with the board, speak with whoever's putting together that RFP about long-term, what are those operation and maintenance costs going to be over at least 10-year lifespan, all the way up to maybe a 50-year lifespan, and really look at the long-term financial implications of going the cheap route now and spending an arm and a leg on heating and cooling, the next year. So just really focusing on that last point again, really consider the long-term costs and benefits to the design. And it's not like we don't know how to do this. There are great design guides out there. There's the New Buildings Institute, Getting to Zero. Not that you have to get your building down to net zero. I mean, that's awesome. I applaud you, but we probably can't do that in our current budgetary frame unless you're a super fancy charter school. They have those in Sun Valley. That's awesome. But at least use it as a starting point for some of the design, as well as the, Achieving Zero Energy, Advanced Energy Design Guide. I believe this is out of ASHRAE. These are free resources. If you don't have them or can't find them, let me know. Our lab can help direct you to them. Our lab can help on design charrettes. I'm really passionate about this. I'd love to see our schools do better within Idaho. On kind of the more political side of things, or just, really enacting some of these changes as designers, as engineers, talk to school board trustees, talk to other people in your community, talk to other parents within your school, or write a letter to the editor and let them know about the long-term energy costs and the benefits that can be had by really building better upfront for a classroom that is thermally comfortable, that's well lit, that's quiet, and is healthy, that has really good ventilation. All right, thank you all very much for your time. There will be a survey. I think Dylan will launch that shortly, so you can let me know how I did. And feel free to unmute yourself and ask away. I also saw a couple chats, so I'll look there while people kind of awkwardly Zoom decide whether or not they want to participate on mute. First chat question is from Williams Anna. Regarding ventilation, have I ever heard of bipolar ionization air filters? Are they effective ways of filtering? I hope I addressed that a little bit. We are doing more research on that. If you want a good intro to that, look on the ASHRAE Idaho website. If you go to ASHRAE Idaho, you will see a little icon for YouTube. Click on the YouTube link, and I think the only lecture that's posted right now is one specifically on needlepoint bipolar ionization. And there's a gentleman locally who speaks on this a little bit as well, Dan Russell. He's a great guy, as well as somebody that is coming kind of from that industry and nationally and speaking to that topic. As I said, there's a few studies out there. It hasn't been as well researched, I'd say, as UVGI or some of these other methods, but that doesn't mean it should be discounted. We're just still in the process of doing a lot of that research, and our lab hopes to participate in some of that research over this next year and provide even more resources and findings on that. So definitely something to consider. I'm not an expert on it yet, but there are those within the Valley who are. So I would also reach out to Jesse Barnum at St. Luke's. He, I believe, is president of ISHE, the Idaho Society for Health Engineers. And St. Luke's uses this technology as well, and he might be able to answer some other questions. I'm sure there are more out there. I don't mean to just profile one or two businesses. Those are just people that I personally know that are involved in this. But as I said, if you want just a YouTube link right now, look at the Idaho ASHRAE website, which is kind of an educational, nonpartisan, great resource. Right. Other questions?